This is the second in our muscle video series. Well, actually, no, it's not. It's the third, because the first was that YouTube video that I posted looking at the different movements like flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. And realistically, before you even watch this video, you really should make sure you have a very clear understanding on flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation. So in this video, we're going to look at the muscles of the upper extremity. So our first learning objective is to describe synergistic versus antagonistic muscles. And I'll explain that as we go through it. Then we'll look at the muscles that move the shoulder in each of these three planes. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the rotator cuff. And then finally, we'll look at the muscles that move the scapula into these movements. At this point, this slide should look relatively familiar to you. Remember, we described the muscle as being this rubber band. It attaches to point A over here and attaches to point B. And what does that muscle do? It moves B towards A or A towards B. And once we can visualize that movement, then we can describe it in terms of using one of these fancy terms: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal and external rotation. So let's go and look at the upper extremity. The upper extremity, the first muscle here is actually not a muscle of the upper extremity, but I include it here because it comes down from the neck. And so this muscle is called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So the sternocleidomastoid, the name itself tells you what it attaches to. Sterno means sternum, cleido refers to the clavicle, and mastoid refers to the mastoid processes. So this muscle attaches from that mastoid process of the neck down here onto the clavicle as well as the sternum. So what does it do? Well, it either brings mastoid point A towards the clavicle and sternum, point B, or it brings clavicle and sternums up towards point A, which is the mastoid process. So if we were to name those movements, what we're going to see is contralateral neck rotation. Contralateral simply means opposite side. So what that means is the right sternocleidomastoid rotates you to the left. So contralateral means opposite side. So the right muscle rotates your head to the left. You would look over your left shoulder, so to speak. It also creates flexion of the neck and atlanto-occipital extension. And what that means, and again, it's a fancy sounding term, but atlas and occiput. It creates extension right there at the occiput and the atlas. And the last thing it does is a coronal plane function. It creates lateral flexion of the neck. So again, if you look here, our learning objectives really consist of the muscles of the shoulder for this video. But like I said, I just wanted to throw in sternocleidomastoid. We'll see sternocleidomastoid again later. So let's start with the deltoid. The deltoid muscle has three functional parts to it. There's an anterior part, a middle part, and a posterior part. Now, all three of those guys do abduction of the shoulder. Abduction, abduction, abduction. So its famous function is in the coronal plane. That's abduction of the shoulder. But the other things that it does, it actually moves the shoulder in the sagittal plane as well. The anterior deltoid does shoulder flexion, and the posterior deltoid does shoulder extension. So again, if you're just making flashcards filled with names of muscles and movements, then this is going to sound like a mouthful. I mean, that's just a lot of stuff. But if what you're doing is you understand these movements and you're standing up right now as you're listening and watching the video and touching your deltoid muscle and moving your shoulder into shoulder flexion, you should even be able to feel that muscle tense underneath your fingers as you move into shoulder flexion. If you do shoulder extension and you can wrap your hand right around the back of that deltoid muscle, again, you can feel that muscle start to bulge. If you do abduction of the shoulder, you can feel the entire muscle start to again, bulge, to get activated. And so this is how you should be doing muscles. If you're just sitting and listening to the video, it's going to be way less effective than if you actually stand up and move the body parts around, move these muscles as you go through them. The deltoid also has transverse plane function, and the anterior deltoid does internal rotation of the shoulder. The posterior does external rotation of the shoulder. Again, that YouTube video shows you what those movements look like, but again, at this point, you should be standing and rotating your shoulder internally as well as externally and feeling those muscles as they're working. Pectoralis major is another one. Pectoralis major is this guy. The pec major is kind of famous. You know, if you do a push-up or a bench press, then this muscle is responsible for what we call horizontal adduction. And if you can take your shoulders right now and bring your elbows out, abduct your shoulders right to about shoulder height. Okay, so abduct your shoulders until your elbow is about shoulder height. And then take your elbow and bring it way in front of your chest. And so if you can imagine that movement as you're doing a push-up or a bench press, that is horizontal adduction of the shoulder. The next thing the pectoralis major does is internal rotation of the shoulder. So again, While we're at this, remember, let's think point A, point B. If this is point A of the attachment of pectoralis major, and point B is the front of the humerus, which you can see, well, you can't see in this slide, but it's on the front of the humerus, then what does it do? That muscle takes the front of the humerus and brings it toward the sternum, or sternum towards front of the humerus. Now, realistically, sternum is not going to go to humerus, because this thing is fixed by all these ribs and such. So the front of the humerus is going to move towards the sternum. And when we have that in the transverse plane, that's going to be internal rotation of the shoulder. So pectoralis major does internal rotation of the shoulder. The biceps brachii is that famous muscle when you contract your muscles and try to show off your muscles. So the biceps brachii is going to flex the shoulder, but it'll also flex the elbow. So this muscle actually crosses both the shoulder as well as the elbow. It crosses two joints. This is another look at the biceps brachii. You see it crosses the shoulder. What I mean by that is going here right over top of the glenohumeral joint, and then it also goes over top the elbow. And so because of that, it can flex the elbow, which is its famous function, but it can also flex the shoulder. Let's go back. There we are. So biceps brachii, flexion of the shoulder as well as flexion of the elbow. And the last thing it does, it actually creates some supination of the elbow. So make sure you understand that supination movement. Let's look at a deeper cut here. So we're a little bit more superficial. Let's go a little bit deeper. And we see some other muscles here. This is pectoralis minor. What does it attach to? Let's do point A, point B. Point A attaches to the coracoid process, and point B, it comes down onto the ribs. So what can it do? It can bring the coracoid process down toward the ribs, or it can bring the ribs up toward the coracoid process. So it draws that scapula anteriorly, right around the rib cage. It brings it just forward. It tilts that forward. Now, let me bypass this one. Let's do coracobrachialis. Coracobrachialis, the name says it as well. It attaches to the coracoid process, and the other part of it goes onto the brachium, in this case, the humerus. So that's the coracobrachialis. So what does that muscle do? And again, I know it's listed here for you, but at each of these, you really should try to make predictions for what this does. If I were to ask you, what does this muscle do in the sagittal plane? Well, you go back and you say, well, the sagittal plane functions are flexion and extension. So what am I really asking you? I'm asking you, does this flex or extend? So we come back here. If I said flexion of the elbow, you'd say, well, that's crazy. It's nowhere near the elbow. If I say flexion of the wrist, you'd say that's crazier because it's even further from the wrist. If I say flexion of the knee, well, obviously it doesn't make sense. So, okay, what does it flex then? It flexes the shoulder. It's going to create flexion of the shoulder. So the other thing it does adduction. Remember that adduction is a coronal plane movement. And so you can imagine if your arm was pointing out in this direction, if you can imagine that for a moment, then you can see, here, let me make that a little bit bigger. There we go. So if your arm was pointing out in this direction, then you can imagine that adduction would look like this. As you see that blue thing move, there I just adducted, adduction. This movement right now that I'm doing is abduction, and that's what the deltoid does. And this right over here is adduction or adduction, and the coracobrachialis plays a role in that. The next muscle you see here is serratus anterior. Serratus anterior, it actually attaches to the anterior part of the scapula as well as the ribs. So what does it do? It brings the scapula toward the ribs or the ribs back toward the scapula. So this is a motion called protraction of the scapula. And remember, that was one of our learning objectives. Describe movements of the scapula, protraction versus retraction. Retraction is when I take my shoulder blades back here and pinch them together. And protraction is, if you can imagine, taking that shoulder blade and rounding it forward. You can imagine if you do a push-up, and at the peak, at the height of your push-up, you try to move your chest even further away. The movement of the scapula there is called protraction of the scapula. Okay. Now let's get into subscapularis. Subscapularis is this guy right over here, and he's tucked right underneath the scapula. So here is another view of subscapularis. There's subscapularis. You see he's on the anterior part of the scapula and goes to the anterior part of near the head of the humerus. So what does it do? It takes that front part of the head of the humerus, brings it towards the scapula, or scapula towards humerus. Well, in this case, one is more likely to move than the other. The scapula is not really going to move towards the humerus any more than it is already because it's blocked by the rib cage. So what happens here? That humerus moves toward the scapula. And in the transverse plane, so again, you should start getting comfortable with these transverse plane movements. Transverse plane, internal and external rotation. Remember, we had this table at the front. You should be comfortable with these movements. So in the transverse plane, what is that scapula going to do? Or what is the humerus going to do? So your guesses right now should be either internal rotation or external rotation, because those are the only possible transverse plane movements. But considering that this goes to the front of the humeral head, it'll be internal rotation. So what do you need to know about subscapularis? It's one of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. It lives in the subscapular fossa. You can't forget that fact, even though we're done with bones, because muscles move bones. And then what is its function? It creates internal rotation of the shoulder. So now is probably, well, actually, let me continue on with some muscles here. Let's go, let's go right over here. So when we look on this slide, we see the trapezius muscle. It's a big triangular looking muscle on the back. So there's an upper part to the trapezius, and then there's a lower part to the trapezius. It attaches to the skull and the cervical spine, and thoracic spine, and down here onto the scapula as well too. So what does it do? Well, the upper part of it is going to elevate the scapula. If you were to shrug your shoulders, thinking of bringing your acromion towards your ears, that is scapular elevation. It can also extend the neck. That would be like if you're sitting and now you decide to look up at the ceiling. That's neck extension. And it also does neck lateral flexion, and that would be like taking your left ear, bringing it towards your left shoulder, or doing the same thing on the other side, right? Right ear to the right shoulder. That is lateral flexion. What does the lower part of the scapula do? Lower part of the trapezius do? The lower part of the trapezius will then depress the scapula. So again, I need you to be able to imagine that scapula kind of sinking down in this direction. If we move it in this direction, like the direction of the arrow that I just made, let me thicken that up just a little bit. So that right there, if the scapula moves this way, that is depression of the scapula. Whereas if you go upwards this way, that would be elevation of the scapula. Now, there's the deltoid, just another look at the posterior part of the deltoid. Let's look at latissimus dorsi. These are your infamous lats. The lats then are going to start off at the spine, and through some of this connective tissue, it attaches to the pelvis as well. This is called the thoracolumbar fascia. So that's point A. The spine, thoracolumbar fascia to the pelvis is point A. What is point B? It goes up and attaches to the humerus. So it actually attaches to the front part of the humerus. You don't get really a good peek here unless we were to move the deltoid muscle, but it does go to the front of the humerus. So what does it do? It creates adduction of the shoulder and internal rotation of the shoulder. So let's think about adduction. So if I were to take my arm, I'm going to move my arrow, and if my fingertips now, if I were to move my arm so my fingertips are pointing in this direction, this movement here is adduction of the shoulder. Adduction. What I'm doing right now is adduction of the shoulder. What I'm doing right now is abduction of the shoulder, and that can come all the way up, right? So deltoid would do that. Then latissimus dorsi and coracobrachialis would do what I'm doing right now, adduction, adduction of the shoulder. So looking at some of the more of the muscles in the back, let's knock out these two, rhomboid minor and major. Those are these guys here. And what does it look like it does? If you just said point A and point B, right? The spine is not going to move toward the scapula. What's the only thing that can happen here? The scapula can move towards the spine. So as it goes up, that is going to be elevation of the scapula. So this will elevate the scapula. Well, who else elevated the scapula? If you recall, the other guy that elevated the scapula was here, the trapezius muscle. So the other thing that's going to happen here is that the scapula will now move medially in this direction. And as it moves medially, that movement is what we call retraction. So retraction and elevation of the scapula. So now is a good time, I think, to review some of these terms. The terms here, so prime mover or agonist, synergist, and antagonist. So what do those mean? Antagonist, you might have heard people say, hey, don't be so antagonistic. Or you may have heard the people use the term synergy, like let's establish some sort of synergy. Antagonism or antagonistic muscles work against the muscle you're talking about. Synergistic muscles work with the muscle you're talking about. So what does that mean? If we come back here and let's look at this muscle over here again. So we said the upper trapezius. Upper trapezius, what does it do? It elevates the scapula. If I were now to ask you, what muscle is synergistic to that? In English, that simply means Well, what other muscle elevates the scapula? And in this case, that would be the rhomboids, for example. Another example would be levator scapulae, and that's this guy, levator scapulae. Levator is to elevate the scapula, and the name of the muscle says it itself. It elevates the scapula. So the upper trapezius and the levator scapulae are synergistic, and what I mean by that is that they both do the same thing. Now, on the other hand, if I were to ask you the question here, the upper trapezius elevates the muscle, elevates the scapula. So what muscle am I talking about? Upper trapezius. So if I were now to ask you for an antagonistic muscle, what that really means is, in English, what muscle then depresses the scapula? And that would be the lower trapezius. Okay, so that's what antagonistic versus synergistic muscles mean. The other rotator cuff muscles are supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. So supraspinatus will abduct the shoulder, infraspinatus externally rotates, and teres minor also externally rotates. So again, I'm going to keep repeating myself here, is that the way I need you to think of this is you need to think of point A and point B. So point A is this part of the scapula, point B is this part of the humerus. So A goes to B or B goes to A, but this scapula is not going anywhere, so that part of the humerus is going to move back this way. Here, if I move this arrow, that part of the humerus is moving this way back towards the scapula. And in the transverse plane, that creates external rotation here for infraspinatus. Supraspinatus, it will be abduction of the shoulder. Teres minor actually has the same function as the infraspinatus. So collectively, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, this guy right over here, these are the 4 rotator cuff muscles. All right. Teres major is not a rotator cuff muscle, and what he does is that he will internally rotate and adduct the shoulder. So he is not a rotator cuff muscle. So this is a good time then to bring in this thing here. This is the study guide. And in the study guide, I listed out all the muscles that you need to know by region. And so we haven't done any of these yet. We're starting right over here only because, again, as I said earlier, I think some of the upper extremity muscles are a little bit more intuitive and accessible. But the thing I have on the back of your study guide is this. I have the upper extremity. So these right here are sagittal plane functions. These are the transverse plane functions. These are the coronal plane functions. And basically here are all the muscles that contribute to that. So there's no guessing, no work that you need to do. So a good study tool might be to take these, you have the Word document, and delete all these muscles, and then fill out this table. Not table, but fill out this paper. And that will ensure that you know which muscles do what kind of movement. And so what we've covered here really is the shoulder. We've talked about all these muscles here, and at this point you should know the muscles that flex and extend, internally and externally rotate, and abduct and adduct. So if I were in your shoes, I would take some time. I would take a few hours to write out those muscles, look at pictures of those muscles, stand up and move your shoulder around in all those planes. And then once you're comfortable with that, then move on into the elbow, wrist, and etc. All right, so to go back, here are our learning objectives for this lecture. We described synergistic versus antagonistic muscles. You now know the answers to number 2 because, they're all laid out for you right here in your study guide. And you know the muscles of the rotator cuff and what it actually does. And then we describe movements of the scapula, elevation, depression, retraction, and protraction, which would be considered, if you go back to our original table here, those would be considered special types of movements, not really existing in any of these planes. Okay, so that'll do it for this video.